Hi, everybody. This is Gino Vanelli. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the persons appearing on the program.
It is officially Gay Pride Month, and it's also the first episode of Season 7 of Rainbow Country. So today, racism and the making of gay rights, a sexologist, his student, and the empire of queer love. Author and historian of queer and trans politics, Laurie Marhoefer will be my guest to talk about this powerful new book. Plus, recording artist, drag entertainer, and DJ Jade Elektra, aka Alfonso King Jr., will be my guest in the Artist Spotlight. All that and more on episode 304, so stay tuned for Gay Talk Radio right here on Rainbow Country.
Hi, this is Emily Saliers from Indigo Girls.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Harder, porn star, burlesque performer, and the creator of Porn to Be a Star. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Well, hello and welcome to a brand new journey through Rainbow Country. As I like to call it, a little gay radio show working to give voice to the LGBT community and beyond. And as always, I am your tour guide through Rainbow Country. I'm producer and host, Mark Tara. By the way, Rainbow Country originates from CIUT-FM in Toronto and now proudly in syndication on 12 outlets across Canada, from coast to coast to coast. The Yukon, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the east coast of Canada in Newfoundland, Ontario, even down to Buffalo, New York, and online. Well, thanks to you tuning in, streaming, downloading, but ultimately listening. Together, we continue to build Rainbow Country into a nationally syndicated gay radio show, a #1 LGBT podcast on Podomatic.com's Gay and Lesbian chart. And by the way, last week, we were #2. As well as being recognized as Canada's #2 LGBT podcast on Feedspot.com. So, today, author and historian of queer and trans politics, Laurie Marhoefer, joins me in conversation to talk about their powerful new history book, Racism and the Making of Gay Rights, a sexologist, his student, and the empire of queer love. We'll find out just who sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld was, the man who laid the groundwork for modern gay rights. And in the Artist Spotlight, Jade Elektra, recording artist, drag entertainer, and DJ. Plus an hour or two, music from LGBT artists, independent artists, voices that we've come to know and love in classic disco, classic 80s, classic house. And on this episode, I'm featuring some classic disco, some Canadian 80s, and more. All that and more lies ahead as we start off this journey into Season 7 of Rainbow Country.
Phone rings. I got a message from the mayor. He's going to call me back the next day. I get the call, and he said, if you'd accept, we'd like to honor you with the key to the city. There was an event later that year in May. Just a key, right? Like, key to what? A decent job, a good singing career. It's really a metaphor, but it's history. So a reporter wants to talk to me and says, well, so it's a key, right? Like, what's the big deal? I said, well, not everybody gets the key. So I looked it up, and I guess it is kind of a big deal.
The date, May 17th, 2018, when trans activist Susan Gapka made history by becoming the first trans woman to be presented with the key to the city of Toronto. By the way, past recipients include Rush, and the Raptors.
Hi, I'm Garrett Conley, author of Boy Erased, a memoir. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Laurie Marhoefer is an associate professor of history at the University of Washington, an author and historian of queer and trans politics. And they start off our interview with a reading from their powerful new gay history book, Racism and the Making of Gay Rights, a Sexologist, His Student, and the Empire of Queer Love.
On July 6, 1931, the American steamship President Cleveland sailed into the mouth of Manila Bay at the end of an uneventful 2-day journey from Hong Kong across the South China Sea. One passenger was already such a sensation in Manila that the reporters and photographers from the newspapers did not wait until the President Cleveland had docked and instead rode along on the harbor pilot's boat to meet the ship. The man they were rushing to interview was a rumpled, diabetic, white and gray-haired German doctor. They found him on board, most likely in the company of his sole traveling companion, a dapper and much younger man, a Chinese medical student who only days before had quit school and bade farewell to his family and his homeland in order to follow the doctor around the world. The student's name was Lei Xiaotong. The doctor, Magnus Hirschfeld, was a sexologist, a scientist of human sexuality. He was also the world's best-known, most committed defender of homosexuals. With Lei at his side, he was on a peripatetic global lecture tour. Magnus Hirschfeld made the modern homosexual, although no one that day in Manila Harbor probably thought so. Looking back from almost 100 years later, it is clear. He co-founded the world's first gay rights group, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, in Berlin in 1897. But what is far more important is that he and his colleagues came up with an enormously influential concept of what same-sex desire was, what it meant, and how it fit into the wider world. If you think homosexuality is an inborn quality that cannot be changed and has a biological root, but is not an illness, and if you think gay people are a sexual minority who are born that way and who deserve legal protections just as racial minorities do, you owe those ideas to Hirschfeld and a handful of others. He was among the first to articulate that conceptual model of what it means to be gay in print in 1896.
Laurie Marhoefer, hi, how are you?
I'm good, how are you?
I am well. Okay, first of all, did I butcher your last name?
No, that was perfect.
Yay! Okay, first of all, I have to say thank you for being here to have your voice, your story be heard by the LGBT community and beyond. So thank you for that, especially to talk about racism and the making of gay rights, a sexologist, his student, and the empire of queer love. Let's start right there. That title, a big title, a provocative title, Racism and the Making of Gay Rights, a Sexologist, His Student, and the Empire of Queer Love. Talk to me about this particular title and if there's a story behind why you chose this title.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this book is the story of the relationship between these two guys, Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a famous German Jewish sexologist in his 50s, and a much younger guy who was a medical student in Shanghai named Lei Xiaotong. And they met in Shanghai in 1931, and Hirschfeld fell in love with Lei, and Lei became his assistant on a world lecture tour where they went all across the world, which was empire, right? This is before decolonization. So they were traveling through the British, Dutch, and American empires, telling people about the naturalness of homosexuality. So that's the Sexologist and His Student. and their journey through empire, and then racism and the making of gay rights. So I was interested in Magnus Hirschfeld because he's really the person who did the most to bring us mainstream gay rights. He's one of the first people to argue that homosexuality was this inborn condition that you shouldn't have to change, that's part of nature. And then from the beginning of his career in the 1890s through to his death in 1935, he became the public face of that idea. He was the first public intellectual who was internationally famous for supporting that idea and for supporting gay rights. He was much better known in North America in the 30s than he is today. So people actually like knew this guy's name. And I was really interested in, he wrote a lot about sexuality, and he also wrote a lot about, quote unquote, the races. And I wanted to know, how did his ideas about race work with his ideas about homosexuality? And what I found in investigating that is that he was racist. He had a persistent anti-Black racism that you can see throughout his thought. And he also had he believed in the races, that there were races in the world. And he believed that, there were meaningful racial differences between himself and Leigh. And he racially exoticized his boyfriend in a way. And, it's not only about we should know that this famous gay activist had some disturbing ideas, but it's also his concepts about whiteness really shaped his concept of homosexuality in a way that opened up a path for gay politics to just ignore racism and really be about white people in a way that I think is really sucked and screwed up gay politics for the next 100 years. But it didn't have to be that way either. He has moments where he sees that gay politics has to include people of color. It can't just be about white people. And then in the course of the book, you also see the fabulous story of Leigh Seo Tung, this queer Asian Canadian guy who lived in Vancouver at the end of his life, and who had his own theories of sexuality. So in this early moment of gay rights, a queer Asian Canadian guy was front and center. So you see that gay politics isn't all about white people, and it shouldn't be. There are other troubling things in Hirschfeld's life story and in his thought that I also would have liked to get in the title. So he has really bad view of disability. He's sexist. Sometimes he's against empire, but then sometimes he's totally fine with empire. So he had a very genocidal view of indigenous people. So if I could have smushed all that in there, but then the title would have been even longer. So that's the title of the book for you.
Is this a history book?
Yeah, it's gay history. Yeah, and it's a love story and it's a biography, double biography.
So you mentioned these two men, they fell in love, and was Magnus, was he an openly gay man back in the 20s and the 30s?
Yeah, that's such an important thing. No, he was not openly gay. I think if you read about him sometimes on the internet, you get this impression that he was, but he was not out. He was really careful to give the public impression that he was an unmarried heterosexual guy. And he had relationships. He was pretty famous, right? So he had to be quite careful.
You were mentioning that Magnus was more famous back in the 30s, in North America. His name was known. Why do you think he fell out of favor then?
Yeah, that's really interesting. In the 30s, he, despite all of the bad things in his thought, he was the most public defender of gay people in Europe and North America. And he was really known for that. And particularly queer people knew his work, but also he was widely read by psychiatrists and psychologists who were anti-gay. And when he traveled across the US, he actually was in Canada briefly too. The press reported his lecture tour. You can tell by the way they talked about it, a lot of people already knew who he was. after the 30s, you know, the 40s and the 50s were this time of this more repressive moment. So the memory of Hirschfeld and like this high point of gay rights got obscured by what came after. I looked at how Magnus Hirschfeld was discussed in like English language psychology in the 50s, and they're still talking all about him, but they're always very critical of him. So after the Second World War, Freud's theories became really important in this, in a very anti-gay interpretation of Freud's theories. So often people will be like, oh yeah, you know, we don't think homosexuality is natural. There was one person who did. It was this, you know, wacky German, and then they'll mention him.
And when did he die?
1935.
He died in 1935. Wow. Because his partner died in the 90s.
Yeah, isn't that incredible? They were 40 years apart.
So who was Li Shutong? Talk to me about him.
Yeah, he was the son of a wealthy banker from Hong Kong, and had gone to medical school, was very interested in sexology, which was the scientific study of sex. It was this mini discipline that Hirschfeld like founded or was one of the founders of. Sexology didn't make it as a discipline. Like they were hoping that there would be, you know, you could major in it in college and stuff, but it hasn't really made it in that way. But in the 30s, it seemed like maybe it would. So Lei was really interested in like studying sexology, and he was living in Shanghai and going to St. John's College there, an English language university that began as a missionary school. And he was like this ambitious, wealthy, young queer man who was really interested in getting out of China. St. John's was a kind of pipeline for wealthy kids to study and then go abroad and be in the foreign service, in the diplomatic service, or go into business abroad. And there are all these, you know, networks of wealthy Chinese people around the world. So that was the path he was on. And he went to see Magnus Hirschfeld lecture. And after the lecture, Lei was very charming, self-effacing guy, very, very stylish, like a dapper, you know, wealthy guy, and I think a confident person. And he went up to Hirschfeld after the lecture and he said, "You've only been in China a couple of days. Do you need somebody to translate for you?" And Hirschfeld, you know, I think probably was immediately taken with him because Lei was so personable and
charming
and very, very good looking guy. Like, you know, how would you feel if you were like in your 60s and this guy in his 20s comes up and is like, "Do you need a translator?" You'd be like, "I sure do need a translator." Like,
So in your book, in Racism and the Making of Gay Rights, you provide, I believe, the first ever account of Lei's theoretical work. What was his writings? Because they were when he passed away in the 1990s, they were found in the trash?
Yeah, so after Hirschfeld died, he lived in Switzerland and Hong Kong, and then he came to Canada in the 70s to Vancouver. And I think a lot of people thought that so Hirschfeld thought that Lei was going to take over, as he was going to be the new Magnus Hirschfeld, and Lei thought that too, and think of like what a cool world that would have been. But unfortunately, the Nazis came to power and the Second World War happened, and the whole project of sexology and like this progressive gay rights activism just got destroyed. So Lei really had nothing to take over. But even so, when he was at the end of his life, I think when he was in his 70s or 80s, he started to write a book about him and Hirschfeld and about his own theories of sexuality, but he didn't publish it. And then when he passed, you know, it's always hard when somebody passes to know what to do with their stuff, right? And they're in the apartment. He doesn't seem to have had a partner when he passed. And a couple of months after he passed, a lot of his stuff was in the garbage at his apartment building. And there was a neighbor walking by who didn't know Lay, but I guess, you know, we're so lucky this neighbor did this. The neighbor saw the stuff in the trash and was like, oh, some of that stuff looks old. Maybe it's valuable. And then he started going through it. And I don't know if he had heard of Magnus Hirschfeld, but he quickly figured out that Magnus Hirschfeld was kind of, I mean, at that point, Magnus Hirschfeld wasn't that famous, but like he was a little bit still remembered. And so the neighbor pulled out some of the stuff and saved it, but then didn't know what to do with it. And then 8 years went by, and Ralph Döse, who's one of the leading historians of Magnus Hirschfeld, through the internet got in touch with this neighbor and ended up going to get the stuff and brought it back to Berlin. So I was able to go to Berlin and see it. And Ralph has wrote a short article about Lay's book manuscript, but other than that, nobody's ever written about it. And it was just so exciting, you know, to see, like, his notes are there and also the manuscript is there. It's not that long. He didn't get that far into it. Many people begin a book and don't finish it. You know, that's that certainly happened to me. But it was so interesting. So he writes in there that after Hirschfeld died, he continued his work. Writes that he went all over the world studying homosexuality. Which is so cool. Like, he visited all these different places. And his big finding is that Hirschfeld was wrong.
In what regard?
He's like, Hirschfeld vastly underestimated the number of queer people. It's a much larger percentage of the human population. It's like, so Lay is very into bisexuality. He's like, which Hirschfeld really minimize the existence of like bisexual people, but Lay's like, it's a huge percentage of the population. And together with people who are homosexual, bisexual and homosexual people together are a majority of the human population, which I was like, what? So excited. I was like, yes.
Say that again. The combination of bisexual and homosexuals
is a majority.
Because I have never heard that. It's always like 10%.
Yeah.
Of the population.
Yeah.
This is amazing.
I grew up hearing 10% too. Yeah. It's like, I mean, it's so great because he's like, you know, it's a nearly, feeling same-sex desire is a nearly universal human experience. And I feel like that's really, I don't know if that's true, but I love thinking about a world, you know, that view of the world. And I do think like feeling same-sex desire for people who identify as straight is really super common, because every time I tell somebody that Lay found this huge percentage of bisexuals, every time I tell that to like a straight person, they're like, oh, right. Yeah, I'm bisexual.
So there's a chapter in the book, Was the Homosexual White? Analogy of the making of the sexual minority. Talk to me about what you're getting at in this particular chapter.
Yeah. Okay. So
because it's a provocative title.
So if you think about medieval Europe, people were having same-sex sex, but people didn't think it was an identity. They thought it was just something that maybe, you know, like, oh, if you get, you know, bad enough, anybody could feel same-sex desire. It was like a pretty negative view. But what happens in the 19th century is people start to be like, no, this is a special kind of person that feels this. This is an identity. And a lot of people know the argument that Michel Foucault made that was like, psychiatry kind of invented that concept. Psychiatry, together in conversation with gay people, came up with the idea that there is a special kind of person, and it's a deep-seated part of who you are. But I found this alternate history that, like, back before psychiatry, there are people who feel same-sex desire who are like, we are a special kind of person. We're a class of people. And by class, they didn't mean socioeconomic class. They meant this kind of broader sense of it, like where they would explain it. by making analogies. So they would be like, we're a class like women are an oppressed class in our society. We're a class like Jews are an oppressed class in our society. And as they got closer to the end of the 19th century, more and more the analogy they made was to racial groups of people who were not white, to people who were racialized as outside of the white majority. And particularly when the First World War happens, there was a big international conversation at the end of the First World War about national minorities and racial minorities in different countries and either protecting them or not protecting them. And a lot of these, Hirschfeld and others were like, yeah, we're gay, we're a sexual minority, like a racial minority, we're like a racial minority. So that kind of analogy, like we are this thing and it is similar to this thing. Unfortunately, the way that works, lots of other scholars, queer of color scholars and other scholars have pointed out that this was a problem in feminism too, but like making an analogy between like gay people and then like people of color, the problem is that often the person making the analogy is assuming that none of the gay people are people of color. Like it becomes this sort of like it makes a really complicated and kind of impossible position in language for queer people of color, and it just defaults to a white queer person. And you can see that in Hirschfeld, that it's like when he imagines the homosexual, he's really imagining a white gay man. So yeah, that's what I mean by that. And that, I'm not the first person to point that out or to be like, hey, that sucks, that's making gay politics hard. But I think to me, it was really interesting to find it at the very beginning of gay politics, like way back in the 19th century. And so for Lay, it left him in a kind of crappy position. Like he's supposed to carry on Hirschfeld's work, but he's a queer Asian Canadian guy living in Vancouver when there's a lot of anti-Asian white racism in Vancouver. And like, Richard Fung writes about like getting clocked going into the gay bars in Toronto because the bouncer is white and is like, oh, Asians coming in here, like, are you really gay? Like that was, Lay had to deal with that. And like the way Hirschfeld set up his model, there's not a lot of space to talk about racism affecting queer people. Though the two men were inseparable, Lay and Hirschfeld had been strangers only a few months before. Lay had introduced himself to Hirschfeld after the older man gave a public lecture to a Chinese feminist club in Shanghai. Soon after, the 24-year-old Lay quit medical school to act as an assistant to the 63-year-old Hirschfeld, who had been traveling alone and was not always in good health. Together, the two men journeyed through a world scarred by colonialism across the American, British, and Dutch empires. Lay planned to arrive finally in Berlin to study with the great man at his celebrated Institute for Sexual Science. Lay wanted to become an important sexologist himself. For his part, Hirschfeld believed that in Lay he had discovered the long sought-after disciple who would continue his life's work after his death. His life's work being the ambitious goal of liberating all of humanity from oppressive, unscientific beliefs about sex and love. By the time they reached Manila Bay, Hirschfeld was also, one suspects, in love with the younger man. Certainly sometime during their world journey, he fell in love. Yet as Hirschfeld and Lay made ready to leave the President Cleveland, their hopes for the future were thrown into doubt. The Americans refused to let Lay off the ship. The Philippines had been an American colony since 1898. The United States conquered the archipelago in a bloody war that killed more than 250,000 people, most of them Filipinos, many of them civilians. White Americans in Manila in 1931 had strict racist views of white superiority, like those that prevailed at the time in the United States. The U.S. had extended the Chinese Exclusion Act to the Philippines. It barred immigrants from China despite the fact that tens of thousands of people had migrated to the Philippines in the 19th century from China. Quote, American territory is closed to the yellow race, the immigration officer told Hirschfeld and Lay when they tried to disembark. Hirschfeld and Lay's story opens up a window onto how racism, as well as anti-racism and colonialism, together with anti-colonialism, were all present at the very beginning of gay politics. Indeed, the ties between racialization and gay politics go even deeper. Ideas about, quote unquote, the races shaped homosexuality as we know it.
And on that note, we will return after this Rainbow Country update.
Hi, I'm writer Adam Smith, author of Deep Sniff, A History of Poppers and Queer Futures. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Summer is in the air. It's a brand new month, and it's also the first episode of Season 7 of Rainbow Country. And here's what's on tap for summer 2022. Mansions of the Moon. Award-winning and best-selling author Shyam Selvadurai will be my guest to talk about his powerful new novel, Mansions of the Moon. Plus, married couple and Broadway veterans Stephen Hanna and Brett Shuford will join me in conversation to talk about their journey towards parenthood via surrogacy. We'll also find out about their online LGBT community for creatives, parents, performers, Broadway husbands, and Deep Throat. The 1972 porn classic comes to Rainbow Country. The little film that helped to create the porn industry and become intimately entwined in American politics. Watergate. The film was written, edited, and directed by Gerard Damiano Sr., who passed away in 2008. I'll be joined by his adult children, Gerard Damiano Jr., Christar Damiano, and artist and businessperson Robin Leonardi, to talk about the 50th anniversary of this classic, historic film, Deep Throat. All that and more coming up on Summer 2022, right here on Season 7 of Rainbow Country.
Hi, I'm Joey Lamar, best-selling author of Mambo Lips and Salsa Hips, and you're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
How did you come to tell this story? How did this come about for you? What sparked the idea to write this book?
I had written another book about Magnus Hirschfeld, and I felt like in that book I didn't think enough about anti-Black racism. So
that was 2015, Sex and the
Weimar
Republic.
Yeah, Sex and the Weimar Republic, 2015. That also looks at gay politics in Germany in the 1920s. But I was really surprised in that book that I didn't encounter that many ideas about empire or about Black Germans. There was a vibrant Black German community in the 1920s that was politically active. Also, Germany had just lost all its colonies. And I thought that I wanted to see how that fit into gay politics, and it didn't come up in the book. And then I thought, well, I must have designed the book wrong, because I know that racism and sexuality are always, people are always thinking about sexuality when they're thinking about racism, and vice versa in the 20th century, in Europe and North America. So what's up with that? So I was revisiting that. And then in the course of revisiting it, so Hirschfeld and Ley went all over the world together. And then Hirschfeld wrote a memoir about their journey around the world. And I didn't know this at the time, but Lay really helped him write the memoir. They wrote it together. I mean, wrote it together is maybe the wrong way to say it, but there's somebody who remembers seeing them working on it together in a library in Switzerland, like sitting next to each other. So Lay had a lot of influence on the book, I think, although Hirschfeld's the author. And I started rereading that book, and neither of them were out. But in the book, there are these little moments where Hirschfeld talks about his student Lay, and you can tell he just loves him. He adores him, and he thinks he's so beautiful and special. And I fell in love with their love story and the way that you could read it between the lines. So even in this moment in the 30s where they couldn't be out, and they had to always, they were always dealing with homophobia and racism, like, you could still see the joy and the happiness. And I, despite Hirschfeld's racism, and I got really interested in Lay, this guy. I was like, who was this younger guy? And then I was able to go to Berlin and see the book that he wrote that he never published. And that was just really special and important. And I found out as much about him as I could, because he's always a footnote in biographies of Hirschfeld. And in a kind of dismissive way, they'll be like the Chinese boyfriend, which I feel like is kind of racist and not cool. But I found out as much as I could about him, and he had just a fascinating life and was really fabulous. And so that was cool. Yeah, that's how it developed. It went from an intellectual history to like just more and more a biography of Lay.
How long did it take you to research this book?
I started working on it a long time ago. I think I started working on it like 15 years ago, and then. Oh
my God!
But it was always kind of a side. It was always kind of bubbling on the side, and then, like 4 or 5 years, really, like the last 4 years, really.
So you've written 2 books. You've written Racism and the Making of Gay Rights. That's your second book, and your first book, 2015, Sex and the Weimar Republic, German Homosexual Emancipation and the Rise of the Nazis. What is it about writing about LGBT history, queer issues, that draws you to those topics? Why do those topics speak to you personally?
Well, I wanted to write gay history, and this is also so true for trans history, to tell the stories of queer lives and trans lives in the past, because it's so important for us who are queer and trans to have this history and this historical memory, the sense of...
And we've always been there.
We have always been there. We've always been there. I always tell my students, like, the first fish that crawled up on the beach and like breathed air into its lungs, like some of those fish were queer and trans. Like there have always been people who felt same-sex desire. There've always, whenever there's like a two gender system or a majority 2 gender system, there've always been people who were crossing from one gender to the other, or in a third place, or like frustrated in some way, like that wasn't working for them. That system is always oppressive of like humanity in some way. There've always been queer and trans people. So that was a big thing for me. But then also I feel like it's such a good way to work out, like reading and writing history is really a way of thinking about the present. So it's a way that you can work stuff out that's happening for you now by reading and thinking about what's happened in the past. And then it also helps you imagine the future. Like in some ways, there's just so much hope in the past for the future. Like my students, we read and a lot. I teach queer and trans history, but like one thing we read is the story of a trans guy who passed for 40 years in New York City. And then it was one of these things where he passed away, he died. And then when he died, people were like, oh, he's a woman. And what's so cool about it is, it's a very sensational kind of anti-trans newspaper article, but like the reporter interviewed people who knew this guy and they refused to use female pronouns for him. They're just like, no, he was a guy. He could drink like a guy. Like, I have to tell you, he was like, yeah, he was such a masculine guy. Like, his being a guy persisted through his death, through the big gender reveal. And my students are so, I think for me, like, it gives me a lot of happiness and like queer trans joy to be like, yeah, this person lived over 100 years ago. And yeah, right on. Like, that is amazing and awesome. They dealt with a lot in their life, but like they were living their life and right on, and their community actually supported them. And it helps you be like, okay, well, is my community supporting me? Like, how can my community be more supportive, right? It helps you think about how the future could be. And the future can be, the present is better than New York in 1903, like right on. And we can have an even better future. And so that's something that the really history, I think, is cool for. You can also see like the mistakes people made in the past, and you can think about, yeah, maybe we don't want to have a queer politics that's super focused on whiteness. Like, yeah, let's think about that and think about what we're doing. And I really like that about it.
So my last question for you is, when audiences read one of your books, is there a takeaway that you hope your audience does come away with after reading one of your writings?
Oh, that's such a cool question. I hope that people come away with both the like, oh, hey, look how people did activism in the past. It didn't have to be that way. There's a long tradition of different kinds of queer activism. Like, it doesn't have to default to this kind of conservative, bad at anti-racism. We don't have to go, like, there's other possibilities. I like seeing other possibilities, but also just the joy of like the queerness and the transness that was fabulous in the past and persists into the present and right on, both of those things, particularly in this book, like the story of these lives. There's particularly with Lay for me, but like there's a lot of, like hope and happiness and celebration that I feel. And I hope people feel that too.
Well said. Well done. Well written, Laurie Marhoefer. I hope I'm saying that right. Thank you.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Thank you for your time and for your knowledge.
Thanks, Mark.
Racism in the Making of Gay Rights, a Sexologist, his student, and the Empire of Queer Love is available wherever you get your favorite books. And for more on author Laurie Marhoefer, you can find them on socials.
Hi, I'm David Pevsner. I'm a writer and an actor. My memoir, Damn Shame, a memoir of desire, defiance, and show tunes, is out now. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Up next, recording artist, drag entertainer, and DJ, Jade Elektra, a.k.a. Alfonso King Jr.
She's a bitch. And you know what? That's right. She's a bitch.
Jade Elektra, hello, how are you?
I am good. How are you?
I am good. Thank you for being here, Jade Elektra, to have your voice, your story be heard by the LGBT community. 2019 was a big year for you, where you released Undetectable, based on Natalie Cole's hit single, Unforgettable. And you changed the lyrics around to get the message across that people that are HIV positive, that are undetectable, they can't transmit the HIV virus to their loved ones, to their sexual partners. And that's essentially the message in Undetectable. You ended up performing in 2019 at the United States Conference for AIDS in Washington, D.C. in September 2019. You ended up on the cover of the Advocates Plus magazine. Talk to me about how this single came about originally, because you performed at the vigil, the AIDS vigil in Toronto?
Yeah. That's really kind of how it started. I was working on an event, we did at that time, we did a monthly event called Mingle. And Derek Yee was one of the people that I was working with to get this event up for ACAS. And I just casually said to him, I said, I've been here for over a decade and no one's ever asked me to perform for the AIDS vigil. He was like, really? He assumed that I had already done it. So he went back to the committee because he was on it, and they talked about it and realized that no drag queens had ever performed at the AIDS vigil. And I was like, oh my God. So they voted to let me perform. Also, Jezebel Bardot performed. So technically we were the first two drag queens to perform there. She lip synced, I sang live. And I did the song. I gave them several options of songs that I thought would be appropriate, but they chose that one. I was a little afraid to do it because I thought, the world is getting so sensitive. And I was like, someone's going to be offended. And they were like, look, we'll handle the flack if whatever, but we want you to do the song. It fits in with our theme. So I go out and I do the song. I am shaking like a leaf, which most people say they didn't see that, but I start the song, and from the first words, I could feel the crowd was with me. And so I just went with it and did it. Honestly, if it was not for Derek Yee, he's no longer with us. I don't think that any of 2019 would have come together like it did. It was great going to DC. I was really surprised that I got the cover of Plus magazine because I did the interview, but I thought, I'm just going to be a feature somewhere in the magazine. I didn't know I was getting the cover. It really kind of, after a decade's work of being an advocate for the HIV positive community, it was a good step to actually get a bigger spotlight so I could try and do more. And I was just about to do more in 2020 when COVID took over and kind of squashed everyone's plans. But I was about to start a small little tour to go promote Undetectable because we had remixes done by Eric Elias. And we have a house version of it. And it just, unfortunately, COVID just knocked the wind out of everyone's sail.
Undetectable, that's what you are. Undetectable, both near and far. Like a song of love that sings to me. How the thought of you does things to me. Never before has someone been more.
So talk to me about during COVID, during a global pandemic, and my understanding is a friend suggested that maybe you pivot your career to a certain degree and you start auditioning for things, and you ended up getting some TV spots and booking a national TV commercial.
Yeah.
How did talk to me about that?
Yeah, I hadn't done any acting or auditioning or anything since the early 2000s when I was still living in New York. And I was a Screen Actors Guild member. I had done several movies back then. But I let all that slide, when reality television came in, there was no work. And so I was just like, okay, why am I paying dues for a union thing? So I let that slide. I hadn't thought about it or whatever. My husband had a friend who was an agent at that time. And he was like, look, the market is calling for diversity. So they're looking for people of color. They're looking for gay people. You doing drag will probably be a plus. You're not doing anything. So why don't I send you out for some stuff? And really, really great guy. Dean Osmond is his name. And he sent me out for, TV commercials and some TV programs. I got a couple of TV spots. But the last major thing he got me was this insurance commercial. And I'm only in it for a couple of seconds or whatever, but like, you can't miss me because I'm voguing as Alfonso. And it's like, that changed everything last year for me because of, then I because you're on a national thing, then more people see you and more people like, oh, hey, let's get him for that or whatever. So yeah, that was how I ended up acting and being background for different things.
There's a saying, when God gives you lemons, you make lemonade. And to me, that's what you did. That's what you've done by, turning a global pandemic and squeezing that sucker into some sweet old lemonade. But you also, now that things are opening up, you have released a couple singles on Trax Records, which is a legendary house label out of Chicago. A little bit of house and 1-800-READ-A-BITCH. Talk to me about this collaboration and how you and Trax Records, how did this relationship come about? Talk to me about this.
Well, I'm constantly working with new producers or producers that I've known for a while. And I was talking to one producer and he told me that he had a connection with Trax. And I was like, oh, it would be so great to, like, for resume purposes, to say that I had a single on this label, because of, if you're into house music,
it's legendary.
It's legendary. Yeah. It's like the Bible of house music. Mm-hmm. And I was just like, oh, it would be so great to have a single on there. So he connected me with the guy who was doing A&R at that time. I sent a little bit of house over, and I wasn't expecting to hear back, because I'm sure they have millions of artists and people trying to contact them. But they got back to me very quickly, like within like a couple of weeks. And they were like, okay, we want to sign this. And they wanted a 2-single deal to start off. And so I was like, okay. And the producer of the track is Benjamin Midwicki. And he did a little bit of house. And then we talked about what the other single would be. And I was like, oh, I haven't done a bitch track in a while. Why don't I do this thing where I'm like,
why don't I read a bitch?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to read someone, but it's a phone call. And then he came up with the idea that it should be a 1-800 number that you call to be read. And
that's a great idea, actually.
Yeah. And so that's what we did.
You're ugly. 1-800. Read a bitch. You need to stop. Read a bitch. Welcome to 1-800. Read a bitch. What can I read you for today? Might I say it was a bold choice of yours to do a video call? Girl, I'm gonna tell you like I told Madonna. Stay indoors until your face settles. Excuse me. In fact, honey, you're looking more and more like a greasy Dionne Warwick. Child, we all can see that you're gay from an airplane. What? You're ugly, your mama dresses you funny, and Pauly D called and wants his hairdo back. I'm gagging. Thank you for calling. Hello? Oh, and before you hang out, don't forget to shave your knuckles.
My last question for you. We're in June, Gay Pride Month. What does Jade Elektra, what does Alfonso King Jr., what do you guys have planned for Gay Pride Month? Do you have any special bookings or anything? Because you're based in Toronto.
Well, I joke about this. Now that my ARRP card has arrived, I'm doing the Seniors Pride. I have no qualms about my age. I'm going to be 55 this year. So they asked me, and I was like, sure. So I'm performing for the Senior Pride, and that is on June 18th. And then on June 25th, I will be, as Jade, I will be spinning for the Pride and Remembrance run. And then later that night, I'll be spinning as DJ Relentless at Buddy's. And then on the 26th, Pride Sunday, I'm spinning in the space called Oasis, which is going to be at like Church in Wellesley. So, I haven't confirmed the time, but I believe it'll be towards the late afternoon, like 5 or 6 is when I start.
And people can go to the Pride Toronto website and check out the listings and the times and the dates and all that sort of good stuff.
Yes.
I have to say, Jade, Elektra, thank you so much for your time. Alfonso King Jr., I know you're in there. Thank you. Well said, well done, and well made up and well recorded.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I have to thank you also for being so supportive. I know that you play some of my tracks for your shows, and I really, really appreciate it. I hope that your listeners enjoy the tracks or find them funny or whatever.
I love How Do I Look? I love that track.
That was a fun one.
Yeah. I have to say thanks again for your time.
Thank you.
For even more on Jade Elektra, you can find them on socials.
Hi, I'm Justin Ling, author of Missing from the Village. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
And just like that, this little gay journey through Rainbow Country has come to an end. For the full 2-hour episode, head over to marktara.com where everything is connected and hit the archives banner. To keep up to date with the show, follow me on socials at Mark Tara. The podcast is available on all major platforms, including audible.com and iHeartRadio. And finally, I want to take this time to thank you for taking your time to be with me. Remember, despite all the noise that's happening in the world today, stay true to this. We are living in days of making dreams come true, so believe in yourself. And the world will believe in you.
Hi, this is Police Constable Danielle Botno, also known as LGBT Cop, and you're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.